In the northern kingdom of Israel, 3 years of uneasy peace with Aram had left one question unresolved. Ramoth-gilead, a fortified city east of the Jordan in the region of Gilead, remained in enemy hands despite an earlier treaty that promised its return. The city was strategic, controlling trade routes and buffer territory between Israel and the Aramean kingdom to the north. King Ahab of Israel had negotiated peace with the king of Aram after a series of conflicts, and part of that agreement stipulated that cities taken from Israel would be restored. 3 years passed. Ramoth-gilead was not returned. Ahab wanted it back. When Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, arrived in Samaria for a state visit, the alliance between the two kingdoms was already sealed by marriage. Jehoshaphat had accumulated great wealth and honor. And his son had married into Ahab's family, binding the southern kingdom of Judah to the northern kingdom of Israel through blood and political interest. During the visit, Ahab hosted a lavish feast and then raised the unresolved matter. He turned to his officials and said, "Don't you know that Ramoth-gilead belongs to us, and yet we are doing nothing to retake it from the king of Aram?" Then he addressed Jehoshaphat directly. "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth-gilead?" Jehoshaphat's response was immediate and sweeping. "I am as you are," he said. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses." The commitment was total, but Jehoshaphat added one condition before the armies marched. First seek the counsel of the Lord. Ahab assembled his prophets at the gate of Samaria. The two kings sat enthroned in their royal robes at the threshing floor, a public ceremonial space where the entire court could witness the consultation. About 400 prophets gathered before them, a massive institutional chorus representing the religious apparatus aligned with the northern throne. Ahab put the question to them, "Shall we go to war against Ramoth-gilead, or shall I refrain?" The response was unanimous. "Go," they said, "for the Lord will give it into the king's hand." One prophet, Zedekiah son of Kenana, made the message visual. He fashioned iron horns and announced, "This is what the Lord says. With these you will gore the Arameans until they are destroyed." The other prophets echoed the promise, prophesying success in unison. The scene was overwhelming in its consensus, theatrical in its certainty, and politically reassuring. Yet Jehoshaphat was not satisfied. He looked at the 400 voices and the choreographed assurances, and he asked a pointed question. "Is there no longer a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of?" The phrasing implied distrust. Despite the numbers, despite the unanimity, despite the symbolic performance, something was missing. Ahab's response came without hesitation, and it was unguarded. "There is still one prophet through whom we can inquire of the Lord," he said, "but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah son of Imlah." The admission was remarkable. Ahab had not merely sidelined an inconvenient voice. He had developed a standing grievance against a prophet whose track record contradicted his preferences. The criterion for acceptable prophecy was not accuracy, but alignment with the king's interests. Jehoshaphat, hearing this, urged restraint. "The king should not say such a thing," he replied. Ahab sent for Micaiah. While they waited, the 400 prophets continued their chorus of victory. A messenger was dispatched to bring Micaiah from wherever he had been excluded, and during the journey the messenger offered counsel. "Look," he said, "the other prophets without exception are predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs and speak favorably." The pressure was explicit: conform to the majority, validate the consensus, do not disrupt the unified message that the king wanted to hear. Micaiah's answer was simple and absolute. "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "I can tell him only what the Lord tells me." When Micaiah arrived at the gate and stood before the two enthroned kings, Ahab posed the same question he had given the 400. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-gilead, or shall I refrain?" Micaiah answered, "Attack and be victorious, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand." The words were identical to the prophecy of the 400. The tone, however, was not. Ahab had heard this prophet before. He recognized the flatness, the mimicry, the deliberate echo that signaled something other than genuine divine speech. "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Ahab demanded. The king was insisting on authenticity from the one prophet he had already admitted hating for never giving him good news. It was a contradiction that exposed the entire dynamic. Ahab wanted truth, but only if it confirmed his plans. Micaiah dropped the sarcasm and spoke plainly. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and the Lord said, 'These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace.'" The image was stark and unambiguous. A shepherd was a common biblical metaphor for a king. Sheep without a shepherd meant a leaderless people. The phrase, "these people have no master," indicated the king's death. The instruction to go home in peace described not victory, but the dissolution of the campaign, an army retreating without achieving its objective. Ahab turned to Jehoshaphat with bitter vindication. "Didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" The prophecy of disaster had been delivered, and the king's response was not alarm or reconsideration, but confirmation of his own complaint. He had been warned, and his reaction was resentment at the pattern, not engagement with the content. Micaiah was not finished. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the multitudes of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. And the Lord asked, 'Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth-gilead so he will go and fall there?' One spirit suggested this, another suggested that. Then a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord, and said, 'I will entice him.' By what means, the Lord asked. 'I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all his prophets.' 'You will succeed in enticing him,' the Lord said. 'Go and do it.' The execution order had already been signed. The trial had concluded before Ahab ever convened his council. The 400 prophets, the unanimous voices of victory, the iron horns and confident assurances, all of it was the mechanism of a sentence passed in heaven and executed on earth. The lying spirit was not a prediction. It was already at work. "So now," Micaiah said, "the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The Lord has decreed disaster for you." Zedekiah, son of Kenana, the prophet who had fashioned the iron horns, stepped forward and struck Micaiah across the face. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go when he went from me to speak to you?" he demanded. The question challenged Micaiah's claim that the Spirit had left the 400 and spoken exclusively through him. It was a defense of institutional legitimacy against the lone dissenter. Micaiah's response was not a theological argument, but a prediction. "You will find out on the day you go to hide in an inner room." The implication was that when the prophecy of victory failed and the army returned in defeat, Zedekiah himself would flee in fear of being held accountable for the false assurance he had provided. Ahab gave the order. "Take Micaiah and send him back to Amon, the ruler of the city, and to Joash, the king's son. This is what the king says. Put this fellow in prison and give him nothing but bread and water until I return safely." The punishment was immediate and specific. Micaiah would be imprisoned, placed under harsh rations described as the bread of affliction and the water of affliction, and held as a hostage to the outcome of the battle. If Ahab returned safely, Micaiah would be proven a false prophet. If Ahab did not return, the imprisonment would stand as evidence that the king had heard the warning and rejected it. Micaiah responded with a final public challenge. "If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." Then he raised his voice so that all present could hear. "Mark my words, all you people." He was binding the credibility of his prophecy to a verifiable outcome and ensuring that the audience, courtiers, officials, soldiers would remember what had been said. The two kings marched to Ramoth-gilead with their combined armies. The forces of Israel and Judah moved east across the Jordan into contested territory, heading toward a fortified city still held by Aram. Before the battle, Ahab proposed a tactical adjustment. "I will enter the battle in disguise," he told Jehoshaphat, "but you wear your royal robes." The plan was transparent in its intent. Ahab would strip away the visible markers of kingship, his robes, his insignia, anything that would identify him as the king of Israel, and blend into the ranks of ordinary soldiers. Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, would remain in full royal attire, visible and identifiable. The strategy placed the king of Judah at maximum risk while shielding the king of Israel from targeted attack. It was a maneuver designed to circumvent the prophecy. If the danger was aimed at the king of Israel, then the king of Israel would simply disappear into anonymity, letting his ally absorb the attention of the enemy. The king of Aram had already given specific orders to his 32 chariot commanders, the elite units that would lead the assault. "Do not fight with anyone, on small or great," he told them, "except the king of Israel." The command revealed the strategic objective: decapitate Israel's leadership, kill Ahab, and the campaign would collapse without prolonged fighting. When the battle began and the Aramean chariot commanders surveyed the field, they saw a figure in royal robes and assumed they had found their target. They turned to attack Jehoshaphat, surrounding him with chariots and converging for the kill. Jehoshaphat cried out. Whether it was a battle cry, a prayer, or simply a shout of alarm, the text does not specify. But when the commanders heard him and looked more closely, they realized he was not the king of Israel. They stopped pursuing him and turned away. The disguise had worked. Ahab's plan to redirect the danger had succeeded in protecting him from deliberate targeting. But the prophecy did not depend on deliberate targeting. Someone drew his bow at random. The phrase indicates an arrow shot without a specific target, a release into the chaos of battle without aim at any particular man. The arrow struck the king of Israel between the sections of his armor, finding the narrow gap where the breastplate joined the lower plates, a space that existed for mobility but left flesh exposed. The wound was serious. Ahab called to his chariot driver, "Wheel around and get me out of the fighting. I've been wounded." But the battle raged throughout that day, and the king could not be extracted. The fighting was too intense, the withdrawal too dangerous, or the wound too debilitating for him to be moved. Instead, Ahab was propped up in his chariot, held upright by his attendants, facing the Arameans. Blood from the wound ran down into the bottom of the chariot, pooling at his feet as the hours passed. He remained there until evening. Then he died. As the sun set, a cry spread through the army of Israel. Every man to his town, every man to his land. The command to disperse signaled the end of the campaign. There would be no prolonged siege, no continued assault on Ramoth-gilead, no attempt to seize the city despite the death of the king. The objective that had launched the war was abandoned. The soldiers returned home. The forces of Judah withdrew. The battle that 400 prophets had promised would deliver the city into the king's hand ended with the king dead and the city still in enemy hands. Ahab's body was brought back across the Jordan to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and buried there. Afterward, someone washed the blood from the royal chariot at a pool in Samaria. As the water ran red, dogs came and licked up the blood, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken through earlier prophecy concerning Ahab's house and the judgment pronounced against him for the murder of Naboth and other offenses. Micaiah remained in prison. The text does not return to him. There is no record of his release, no account of vindication or restoration, no indication that the fulfillment of his prophecy led to his freedom or to any reform of the system that had silenced him. The lone prophet who spoke the truth was last seen being led away to confinement and affliction, and the narrative moves on without resolving his fate. On the 400 prophets who had promised victory and who had been exposed as vessels of a lying spirit faced no recorded consequences. There is no mention of their being questioned, dismissed, or held accountable for the false assurance they provided. The institutional apparatus that produced the unanimous lie remained intact, and the proximity of prophets to royal power continued unchanged. Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem, having narrowly escaped death in a war that brought him no gain. He had committed his troops, risked his life, and nearly been killed due to a misidentification made possible by Ahab's plan to use him as a decoy. The immediate aftermath is recorded later in Chronicles. When Jehoshaphat returned to his palace, the prophet Jehu son of Hanani went out to meet him and delivered a rebuke. Or should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, the wrath of the Lord is on you. The alliance with Ahab, sealed by marriage and renewed in the decision to march to Ramoth-gilead, was characterized not as political pragmatism, but as complicity with wickedness. Yet Jehoshaphat's dynasty continued, and the structural relationship between Judah and Israel remained complex and unresolved. Ramoth-gilead stayed under Aramean control. The treaty violation that Ahab had sought to correct remained uncorrected. The strategic vulnerability on Israel's eastern border persisted, and the contested city continued to be a flashpoint in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Aram. The campaign achieved nothing except casualties and the death of a king. Ahab's son, Ahaziah, succeeded to the throne of Israel and reigned for 2 years. The text records that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father and mother, and in the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. The systemic problems that had defined Ahab's reign, idolatry, corrupt prophetic institutions, the suppression of dissenting voices, were not addressed by his death. The pattern continued under his son. The collapse that the narrative records is not limited to one king's death. It extends to the soldiers who marched under false prophetic assurance and returned home leaderless. It extends to the households across Israel and Judah that absorbed the casualties of a failed campaign launched despite explicit warning. And it extends to the political instability of a northern kingdom whose king died in a battle that should never have been fought. It extends to the erosion of trust in prophetic voices as the spectacle at the gate of Samaria demonstrated that a majority could speak with confidence and be utterly wrong. And it extends to the unresolved vulnerability of a system in which truth could be imprisoned while lies were enthroned, where a king could filter divine counsel by personal preference, and where the institutional weight of numbers and proximity to power could suppress a solitary accurate word. The arrow that killed Ahab was described as random, shot at no one in particular. Yet it found the one gap in the armor of the one man who had disguised himself among thousands, the one king who had been named in the heavenly council, and the one figure whose death had been decreed before the battle began. The disguise failed. The lying spirit succeeded. The prophet was vindicated but remained imprisoned. The 400 were discredited but faced no consequences. And the army that had marched under unanimous prophetic promises of victory returned home exactly as Micaiah had seen in his vision. Scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, a people with no master, each man told to go home in peace because the war that promised triumph had delivered only death. The systemic failure persists beyond the page. No reform follows. No alternative prophetic structure emerges. No institutional accountability is imposed. The mechanism that allowed a king to curate his counsel, silence dissent, and march his nation into disaster remains operational. The cost is borne by those who had no voice in the decision, soldiers, families, subject populations, while the centers of power absorb the lesson not of humility, but of continuity. The question the narrative leaves unanswered is not whether the prophecy was true. The dogs licking blood at the pool in Samaria confirm that. The question is whether a system that punishes truth and rewards alignment will ever produce a different outcome, and whether the next king, facing the next decision, will choose any differently than the one who went to war against his own death sentence.